Okay, well, let's take a quick look at our discussion questions for this unit as well. Who were the major figures in the Jewish return from Babylonian exile, and what did they accomplish? Well, we sort of covered that at the beginning. The priests replaced the kings as rulers. We had an international Jewish identity with the diaspora now, but the Jerusalem temple was the undisputed center. Of course, that was also the focus of all the argument because it was the undisputed center, but at least there was a common point of reference. We have this new theology of monotheism firmly established. We get authorization to rebuild a temple that's established under the authority of a written Torah that the priests get to interpret and apply. Next question was, what was the basic structure of the temple? What were the different functionaries and employees? So we talked about the priests, the Kohanim, the Levites were sort of like the temple attendants. They also played music. You know, they were sort of the assistants. In fact, my mother's family were Levites. Their last name was Levitt. So in theory, they could have been pressed into service as custodians or whatever in the temple if it had been rebuilt. But, you know, we're now just Yisrael because my dad didn't have that pedigree. Susie?
Yeah, question. The rings that you describe in terms of closer and closer, do you think that Dante had that in mind at all when he did the circles in his poetry?
No.
I mean, that's one of the things that comes to mind when you.
But I mean, the concept of a stepped tower goes back to the Babylonian ziggurat. I mean, you know, sometimes it's geometry. It doesn't have to be cultural inheritance. I don't know enough about Dante to say yes or no. Honestly, it seems unlikely. You know, I mean, Dante, I would think, is much more influenced by the cosmology of the era, where you believe the Earth was the center, and then everything else revolved in circular orbits around the Earth, further and further out. So that might have been more what he was considering. Cindy, were you going to add something?
Just Catholicism has similar structures too, where, you know, there are parts of the faith, parts of, you know, the buildings and, you know, the Vatican that are only accessible by certain people. So, you know, if you're, you know, at that point, you know, if you're a woman, you can only be, you know, in so many places. If you're, you know, an acolyte, you're in so many places, and so on. So I think that that's just kind of generally a common theme. I think whenever humans have the chance to be exclusive, they try to be.
Right. Well, you know, again, to draw it back to The Crown, which I've been watching, one of the major transitions that happens in season 2 is they decide that the debutante ball should be open to anybody, not just the lords and, you know, the nobility. And so they have representatives from, you know, this one family, he's a boxer, this other one sells shoes, and the queen and her mother are like, ugh, who are these ordinary people here? But on the other hand, you know, that's an egalitarian ethos where before they could say it's just the nobility, and the discussions of who outranks who and when, and, you know, the fact that Philip, before he was made a prince, was outranked by his 8-year-old son, who was the heir to the throne, you know, it becomes a major plot point. So yes, hierarchies and who's allowed where and to do what, that's an old story and universal. Yeah, Elliot.
So going back a few sessions, going back to the first temple, how does the sacrifice differ? I don't remember. How does the sacrifice differ between then and now, and the priests versus the prophets? They did similar things.
Right. Well, the question is, how much of the ritual described in the Torah was done at the first temple versus at the second temple? We're pretty confident the second temple followed what was done as described in the Torah. We're not so sure about the first temple. For one example, during the reign of King Hezekiah, Hezekiah is described as talking to God directly. Sometimes David offered sacrifices with his own hands. He didn't have a priest around at all. So it's not clear the priests were as important in the first temple period as they became in the second temple period. It's one of the reasons why the book of Chronicles, which appears at the end of the Hebrew Bible, is a retelling of all the stuff in the books of Kings, but making the priests more important. Because the priests had the Book of Kings version and said, wait a minute, we're all the priests. There should be more priests in here. And so they had to retell the story, adding more priests and more authority roles. The priests are really almost subordinate to the kings in many cases. And, you know, if the king wants to appoint priests on a high place somewhere else, he does it. And if he wants to fire him, he does that. and they're subject to the whim of the kings.
So Adam, if supposedly in the Holy of Holies was the Ark,
Mm-hmm.
and we suspect that it really wasn't an Ark. Therefore, some priests had to construct it, and they knew they were constructing it. I mean, how else could there be an Ark in the Holy of Holies? And in Shechem, they had another Ark
Mm-hmm.
that somebody had to construct, and they knew it.
Well, I mean, if you have all the incense, you can't see. I mean, theoretically, the priest could think there was an ark in there, but since they can't see anything, never actually noticed that it's empty.
Well, okay, so this is the question that often gets asked by Orthodox Jews who are challenging the historical perspective. And they'll say, I have an unbroken chain of tradition going back to Mount Sinai that God revealed this text to us. And you really want me to believe that someone just showed up with a book and everyone just bought it? Or that someone built this ark and everyone just said, yeah, that's an ark from God. Wow, amazing. Like, you want to think people are that dumb? So it's actually used as an argument to justify the traditional perspective by saying nobody could put over something on people. And if we've learned nothing in the last 4 years, it's that people will believe what you tell them.
Are they not familiar with the Church of Latter-day Saints?
I mean, there's all right, golden tablets found in the woods and buried and vanished and go up to heaven. I mean, there's all kinds of stories. There's a story of a mass revelation in Native American, like Aztec mythology, where 20,000 people saw the god appear and do so and so. And I mean, there are other stories in other cultures of the same kind of thing. And we have to remember, in a pre-modern period, authority was really important. People bought it. They believed it. And if the authority tells you something, it takes one generation to establish the ark, right? And it could have meant something else when it was first done. Like, here's a classic version of a family tradition with the same kind of end, where in this family, they always cut the ends off of their brisket when they're making it. And no one can remember why they're doing that. And so they ask the older relative and then the older relative, and they finally go back to the great grandmother who's still around. And she says, well, the pan was too small. But now, even with bigger pans, they still cut off the ends because they've always cut off the ends, but they forget the original meaning of the story.
There's another great story, army story.
Yeah. We don't have time. We gotta move on. It's a similar kind of joke where people are doing it for an old reason and they just do it for the old reason because they don't even think about the reason. So this is the tricky part, is that you can change a theology and approach if people believe it in a world of authority. People today are sort of disbelieving that in 1947 or in the 1950s, the fact that a member of the Church of England couldn't marry someone who was divorced, if the spouse was still living, would actually cause a crisis in the monarchy. Really? Over divorce? Yes. People actually took this religion stuff seriously, and some still do. So you have to put yourself back in that world. So some of the surviving remnants of this, we have those family names: Khan, Cohen, Levi, Levine. There are still some religious laws for Levites or for Kohanim. They get a special blessing in the synagogue, for example. The first Torah reading is usually set aside for a Kohen. If you have a firstborn son, you have to do a redemption ceremony, you do it with a Kohen. There's little like token things, but no real hierarchy like there used to be. Number 3, what were some of the principles and laws of the Torah that justified and defined priestly authority? We went through this to focus on one temple, the purity laws, the sacrificial worship, the calendar. And then, of course, it says, these are the priests from the line of Zadok. Those are the only ones that are allowed to be in charge. Now, what were some of the problems created by the priestly principles of monotheism and monolatry, one God and only worshiping that God in one place? What are some of the problems, like theological challenges with that approach?
Well, when you have a diaspora, for example, or even just the population, I mean, if all 16 million Jews were in Israel right now, they would all converge on the temple and do what 3 times a day? Right. Just saying.
And don't forget technology in that era. Traveling was arduous and long and slow. And so that you know, that was something you could do, you know, once in a lifetime if you were further away than the suburbs, basically.
Well, the other problem, of course, is that if this is one God who's universal for everybody, and yet you're saying, but it's only really for us, and only, you know, I mean, and it's only in one place, that becomes a real major problem. It's kind of really a contradiction built in.
Right. In fact, one of the words for the temple was the Beit El, literally the house of God. It's if God was to live on earth, this is where he would go. This is his Airbnb.
Well, another
It's also not great for like diplomacy and interacting with your neighbors when, you know, everyone else is like, you know, oh yeah, no, my God, I prefer this God, you prefer that God, and you're like, no, there's only one God, it's ours, and all of you are wrong.
And you can't say his name.
And you can't say his name. And he likes us best.
Right.
Thank you. We've talked about one of the other problems, and that if there's only one God and he's all powerful and we're his favorites, but we're not on top of the world, you have to rationalize that disconnect. And so they came up with this idea that God is so powerful and so all powerful that he uses everything else to punish the Jews for not being good enough.
It also creates a very risky situation, because if you have only one temple, you put all your eggs in one basket. And if, being a small kid on a big rough block, your temple gets conquered or destroyed or made impure by being forced to include other gods, what are you going to do? Well, we'll see a couple of responses to that. No, you might have to change what you do. So we'll see a couple versions of that, because the Maccabees face one challenge of the temple being defiled by polytheism, and then the rabbis face a different challenge of the temple being destroyed and having to say, what can we salvage out of this wreckage that was sacrificial Judaism? And we'll see how they make another clever turn. As clever as the priests were to outmaneuver the prophets, the rabbis were super clever to co-opt and redirect priestly sacrificial Judaism into rabbinic Judaism. But we'll learn about that more in January. Number 5 talks about the J and P versions of the story of Noah. You know, you can find websites actually that explore this in a very clear parallel fashion. So here's one of them where they actually break out the story into 2 parts. So the J story is the Lord or Yahweh stuff, and the P story is the priestly stuff. And so here, if you read one column or the other column, it actually doesn't repeat itself. It goes sort of straight forward. They describe the planning of the flood. Noah has a special status. How many animals go in? How does the flood start? How long does the flood last? Again, the rain falls for 40 days, 40 nights. The water swelled for 150 days. Which is it? How long were they in the ark? Up to what point? And again, you'll notice the priestly version talks about corruption and violence. It talks about purification. It talks about a strong focus on the calendar, the second month, the 17th day of the month. This is a priestly order calendar, whereas the other one doesn't talk about calendar dates at all. And then there's a promise never to curse the earth, or the positive covenant of the rainbow. So this is one example of showing that story broken out to reflect the different ideologies of the sources. And then finally, given their general attitudes toward theocracy, sacrificial worship, and priestly authority, but also our commitment to Jewish history and archaeology, how might or should secular humanistic Jews respond to controversies about the Western Wall and the Temple Mount in Jerusalem? I mean, we don't want to see a temple rebuilt, I hope. I mean, reestablish the animal sacrifices and the blood and the splashing and all that, and the courtyards and everything else, and the hierarchy and the high priest and the pilgrimages. By the way, you may know there's something on that Temple Mount right now. It's called the Dome of the Rock, or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You know, the Western Wall, which is thought to be the supporting wall closest to where the Holy of Holies had been, is where Jews go. But on top of that mount is the Dome of the Rock, built around supposedly the rock on which Ibrahim almost sacrificed Ismail, again, according to Muslim theology. And it's also
Muhammad
called the Mosque of
ascended to
Omar.
heaven. And Muhammad ascended to heaven from that rock. I
Right,
mean,
his
it's very
night journey
important.
was the last step before he went up to heaven. Right, so it's a very deeply rooted and an important site for Muslims. And in the 1980s, there was actually a Jewish plot that was foiled to dynamite the Dome of the Rock as the demo in preparation for rebuilding the temple. Fortunately, it was stopped, but that fear has been there for Muslims for a long time. They've been digging tunnels under there, and people are worried that that's going to be a problem. The claim the Al-Aqsa Mosque is in danger has led to pogroms and riots and intifadas going back to the 1920s. So it really is a flashpoint. And if we're in favor of peace and not violence, we're not going to be rooting for a rebuilding of the temple, because the river of blood you'd have to wade through to get that rebuilt would be quite a disaster. On the other hand, it is a site of Jewish history. We have an attachment to that place. I've told the story before when I first went to the Western Wall and I felt how smooth the stones were. It was smooth because of all of my ancestors who had touched those stones, and there was something electric about being in the same place where they had been and they had longed to go and they had touched the stones. And I didn't leave a note in the wall or anything, but I still felt a connection to the place from a history, and if nothing else. So part of our challenge is that this is a place of deep emotional meaning and a religious meaning for so many people, but it's also a historical site. And so we can have an attachment to it that's totally secular. A lot of the people who go to the Temple Mall, the Temple Mount for being Muslims, or the Western Wall if they're Jews, may not be praying to a God any other time, or even when they're there, but they feel a connection to the place because of the connection to the history that's there, and that makes it even harder to negotiate.
Okay, I'd like to make one more observation about purification.
Okay.
That the Jews weren't the only ones who, in those times and places, were doing it. There's a lot of stuff in the Greek mythology about people do these horrendous killings. They feed their kids to them. They get fed their kids, so they feed the kids to somebody else, and you have to find somebody who will purify you to expunge that kind of sin. So it was not unique in our tradition.
No, absolutely not. I mean, even in Islamic practice, there's a practice of purification before prayer. Although, interestingly, you can purify yourself before prayer with sand in Islamic practice. So again, it's not about clean. It's about this ritual purification process to get the spiritual schmutz off. And so, water or sand are equivalent if the intent is the same, and you don't have access to water to be able to waste it in that way.
I gotta say because I lived in a Muslim country for a while, one cool little tidbit that is sort of a side effect from that. There were mosques like everywhere, but every mosque had like a water fountain on the side of it that even if like anyone could go and like poorer people could go and fill their jugs up with water and stuff and get free water there from just the side of the mosque, which is pretty neat.
Even if the intent was to wash your feet before you enter as a purification ritual.